I'm going to try to go through a lot of material right now, and I want to take some time to look at the paintings, to really dwell on some big ideas, but there's a lot of content. So if I'm going too fast, please just jump right in, tell me to slow down, ask a question. I don't want people to feel like they're just watching voyeuristically some exhibition, but it really, I'm hoping that there's a sense of participation and interactivity. So without further ado, let me just begin my slideshow. Oh, Evan's in. Okay. Yeah? Oh, okay, fantastic. All right, so I've chosen to call this class Franklin, West, and Morse, the creation of a new Renaissance movement. I've had several thoughts in my mind as I was developing the composition, the gestalt that I'm going to develop today. Number one, the offer by Anton Chaikin to deliver a presentation next week was part of my motive. At first, I was going to do something on music a few weeks ago, and I decided to change that up in light of what Anton's going to go through. And Anton, knowing that his book has just come out, I've had a chance to read it. He will be going through some of the forgotten dimensions of the American Revolution as a global experience that really was spearheaded by the figure of Benjamin Franklin, who did much more than people realize across Europe and Britain especially, in really evoking the best qualities of Britain. And by that I mean the Shakespearean, Thomas More, Henry VII traditions that were always anti-imperial, profoundly Neoplatonic and humanistic. And there was always a battle, just like today, there's a battle between the two Americas that we see playing out inside of the United States. A legitimate sovereign impulse, an anti-imperial impulse, something that really cares about the general welfare and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And then you have this other thing that people have sometimes called the deep state, but this other America, or at least America in a name only, that is much more in alignment with the British Empire way of thinking about organizing society culturally, politically, economically. So the same thing happened in Britain. Benjamin Franklin himself was, he lived his life as a British colonist, somebody who thought of themselves as British, but of the better variety, and organized a network of scientists across Europe to really spearhead the industrialization of Britain and the creation of a new type of paradigm of political economy that, again, people don't realize this American dimension to it. So this, without understanding this master key, trying to piece together history is very difficult indeed. So the figures that you might not know so much about that I'm going to introduce are Benjamin West and Samuel Morse. I'm not going to say too much about them just yet, but I want to begin with a painting. So this is a painting by Christian Chaussel, who was a European painter who moved and became a leader of a cultural leader inside of America in Pennsylvania and New York during the Civil War. This is a painting called Men of Progress. And I think it showcases on a variety of levels the paradox within America currently that's being exploited by the United States' historic enemies to destroy it from within. And what you have here is an array of scientists and inventors from the United States. There's figures like Samuel Colt, there's Joseph Henry with his elbow near the pillar in the back. He's the father of electromagnetism in America. And everybody's sort of centered around the figure. You see that guy with his right hand on the table, right? Do people know who this figure is in the center? Feel free to take your mics off of mute.
No, not at all.
Okay. So that's Samuel Morse. And Samuel Morse is renowned for pretty much having discovered something we today call the Morse code, a series of taps of sequences that are used in the device next to his right hand on the table. That was the first way that we as human beings were able to transmit information miles and miles away using electricity, and the code system that he and a few of his collaborators pulled together, because he didn't do this alone. He did this with the help of many people, including Joseph Henry, Alexander von Humboldt, and various European scientists were part of the network that he was a leader of, that innovated a way that you could take the new discoveries of electricity that were only made a few decades earlier by Benjamin Franklin, and that had been innovated by people like Alexander Volta, by Carl Gauss, Wilhelm Weber, André Marie Ampère of France. And there had been developments and insights into how electricity not only is something which we have been able to create by rubbing amber together. The name electricity, electro, comes from the Greek word for amber, and this was observed a long time ago, that when you rub amber together, you're able to get a little electric shock. But it remained somewhat obscure until Ben Franklin was able to create a series of tests that were able to demonstrate that the same thing coming out of clouds overhead during thunderstorms it's of the same nature as what we had coming out of a Leyden jar or amber. That static electricity is the same, and it's, he conceptualized it as a form of fluid. Ben Franklin was also the guy to develop a sense that there's a negative and a positive component to it, based on an overabundance or absence of a certain type of the fluid that he was thinking about. Alexander Volta and many others discovered that you could compile piles that would be considered batteries that would hold the charge that could be then used later. That it was found in even life, that when you wanted to move a limb, that electricity is a part of that formula that makes it work. So the idea of transmitting information at the speed of electricity was an increase of the cognitive power of man over nature that people don't realize how transformative that really was. So the telegraph and the system that was applied in the United States first, and then spread across Europe and Canada and beyond, it really was transformative. And the person of Samuel Morse was a vital component to that. I think that there's an irony in this, and I didn't really say why I think this gets across the American crisis currently, but this painting was done in 1862. And as we all know, in 1862, America was going through its own civil war. And many people are saying that the current schism inside of the United States does have it on the precipice of another civil war today, which if you look at some of the things that are the weaknesses within America, within the American culture that are being capitalized on, that are driving the civil war deeper into a crisis and even a global war today, it deals with the inability to reconcile two aspects of the American Constitution. On the one hand, you have the enshrining of the sacredness of the individual and individual freedom in the Declaration of Independence. On the other hand, you also have a nation that's founded upon the principle of the general welfare, the welfare of the whole, that we're willing to make sacrifices for the good of the whole nation. And a lot of people have had a difficult time reconciling these apparently two different impulses of individual sacred liberty and the liberty and the sacred welfare of the whole. And that's always been there. In the case of the Civil War, we've had a lot of fallacies of this argument, where people called Lincoln a dictator and a tyrant for trying to abolish the rights of certain other people in the United States to their freedom to own human slaves. We've had the abuses. I mean, the amounts of abuses that we've seen against Native Americans, against Africans that were imported from Africa into the United States, as well as just immigrants, right? There's many cases throughout many generations of immigrants from Ireland, Catholics coming in who are being persecuted and starving and being starved in the British Isles, coming to the United States and facing very, very harsh and unjust treatment. So we have these different aspects of prejudice that's there. It's a thing. So how do you really get across and reconcile these things? The domain of culture, of science, of the arts, of music is a really important component to all of this. And this has been understood better in past generations. It's less understood today, the real battleground of culture. I mean, we see it too. Like a lot of Americans today are being induced, the better Americans who are really fighting and rallying around the flag to defend the Union currently against the current color revolution that's underway. A lot of them are being we're finding a high level of susceptibility to the idea that the real bad guy, the real villain in all of this show is the Chinese Communist Party, and that the Chinese are really the global supervillains out behind everything bad that's going on in the world. And people are being very induced to accept these arguments that are being infused through various intelligence operations into the zeitgeist through Epoch Times, Falun Gong, which are both CIA operations. Steve Bannon and his crowd, who's tied to that, they're basically capitalizing on the idea that no, America is about individual liberty, individualism, and the Chinese are all about sacrificing the individual for the whole, and that's why they have a totalitarian dictatorship. That's really at the heart of the Great Reset and all of these other things that are threatening nation states. So a lot of these, if you look at the line of the reasoning to justify the idea that China is at the heart of the operations against America, it's foolish. There's all sorts of blank spots, weaknesses in the line of thinking, but people are susceptible to it because, again, they blame anything which deals with the welfare of the whole, which includes also their own history, like when Franklin Roosevelt or Lincoln or Alexander Hamilton or Benjamin Franklin fought to create a general welfare clause. They think that that's also a bad thing. A lot of Americans think that was terrible. So anyway, just throwing that out there. So the role of culture in resolving this paradox is not very well understood. This is another painting by Samuel B Morse with a small quote. It's another close-up of his telegraph wire, where Samuel got at it in one way, where he says, there is doubtless danger, but I believe in the possibility by the diffusion of the highest moral and intellectual cultivation through every class of raising the lower classes in refinement. This is what he's getting at is an understanding that was that animated his life as a scientist, as an inventor, as well as most of those people that we saw in the painting before us, including the painting of Benjamin Franklin himself, and a few other characters that we're going to investigate. But when America was founded, when the United States was founded as an independent republic, a democratic republic, it was built around the idea that there would no longer be two classes or castes of those hereditary elites that were born into classes of privilege, and then they would have their own set of rules, their own set of operating procedures that they would govern themselves by, as well as their own separate culture for the elite, their own separate elite music, their own separate elite paintings that they would enjoy, while the masses had their own separate slave culture and slave ethic that would apply to them. That idea of the two cultures was no longer accepted in the idea that everybody was sovereign. It wasn't that there was one sovereign, but that now sovereignty was an inalienable aspect of every human that was part of your nation, and that every human being had inalienable rights because of that. And there was a certain faith, in a sense, that we all had access to self-improvement, our conscience, our ability and our power to use our reason and mature our reason, to harmonize and mature our identities as active participants in a republic. And that was what Benjamin Franklin said to the lady in that apocryphal story, what have you given us, after the Constitution was established? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. So it's all that clause, the conditionality is that it's not a successful formula forever. It always requires the reliving of the best ideas that gave birth to the revolutionary spark, and that real appreciation for the values where people were willing to sacrifice their lives in 1775 to 83 for the sake of ideas. So that's not something that you could ever take for granted, which is why it's a republic if you can keep it. The idea of the raising the lower classes in refinement is a part of that. You have to have one culture for everyone and not two separate or more cultures. So another place where Samuel Morse, the inventor, unites with Samuel Morse, the painter, because again, people know him as an inventor and a scientist, but they don't realize that his actual first 40 years of life were primarily devoted to the cause of painting and the institutions that he created, not only in the sciences, but also the institutions in the realm of painting and photography, endured far beyond his life, and he knew it. So this is a part of a lecture series that he gave across the United States, justifying a new idea of painting that was more in alignment with the ideals of the US Declaration of Independence and Constitution that had just recently been created. And he says here in this longer speech of this is a small excerpt where he says, it becomes a question of some importance whether it be not possible to lay the foundations of a just taste in the fine arts in our country on such principles that a substantial fabric may rise in as beautiful proportions as the temple of our political constitution. That the foundation may be strong, it should be laid not in authority, however ancient, but in the never-changing principles of nature. Authority in all its forms usurps the place of truth and reason. So this is, I think, a very, very clear-cut, insightful quote that gets at the importance, because the United States, again, it was a brand new country. He was saying this in 1827, 28 was when this speech occurred. And how do you create a school of the arts befitting of a society that really values and cherishes freedom, and that doesn't have the oligarchical structures governing it? Behind, I chose a painting that Samuel Morse did of Niagara Falls with certain natives just going about their business, you know, around the cliff side. I think you have a couple of Westerners in there too. Not sure of the full implications of the story, but just to get across, this is a man who had talent. So how do you create a foundation of a new school of painting, a new ethic that's embedded in the aesthetical principles that don't rely upon simply authority as a substitute of truth and reason, which is natural to all of us? So on such principles that a substantial fabric may rise in as beautiful proportions as the temple of our political constitution. That was a big problem. How do you do it? Because it really wasn't happening. It wasn't happening very much. Even though the U.S. had been around for almost 50 years, there really wasn't a strong aesthetic tradition, not in the music, not in really painting or architecture at this time. So that was on a lot of people's mind, because really, I mean, when you give yourself to admiration of something, it was known through the writings of Plato, Pythagoras, that were recounted by Plato, that which we give our admiration to, we become more like, we awaken that within our own souls that we admire on the outside. So if you admire things that are ugly, obviously ugliness will awaken inside of you, that you then become a little bit more like that, those archetypes. If you admire something which is beautiful, you awaken something beautiful within you as well, inversely. So this is not a secret. This is something that's been known by empires for a long time, which is why empires rely on certain aesthetical ugly principles, or principles that don't make us better people, but in fact stagnate our potential instead of enhancing and activating that potential. So there was two artistic paradigms at this time. In 1808, you had the foundation of a school of painting in the United States called the American Academy of Fine Arts. And the American Academy of Fine Arts was set up by John Trumbull and a grouping of people whom Jerry has written a lot about. Anton Chaikin will go through a little bit of this in our paper, in his presentation next week as well. But the surviving, the leaders of the Federalist Party under the person of Robert Livingston, who was the Grand Master Freemason of New York. These were people who, after Alexander Hamilton died, were the real pro-British Anglophile aristocrats of the West, that operated on one level as the opposition to the Democratic Party of Jefferson, but in reality were sort of just a counter-gang operation, two sides that were both anti-constitutional and were played by British intelligence against the better interests of the young nation. as partial proof of that, Robert Livingston, who was himself one of the leading assistants to Benedict Arnold, who we know was a traitor for the American Revolution. That's part of the reason why some major battles, including Canadian battles, failed, was Benedict Arnold playing a certain role as a British agent undermining these battles. That was discovered by the end of the War of Independence. One of his close collaborators, Robert Livingston here I'm talking about, was also Aaron Burr. And when this Academy of Fine Arts was created, Aaron Burr had only recently departed for London, where he stayed for 5 years in the house of Jeremy Bentham, because he was caught at the heart of a conspiracy to break up the United States by declaring himself sort of the tyrant king of a new Western front that would then go in and take over control of the White House and declare an alliance integrating the free states that didn't have slavery with British Canada, and have a new sort of confederacy run by sort of him as a king. And this all came out in testimonies. Insiders blew the whistle before the plan could really go ahead. And several other plans, incarnations of this plan, had already been attempted and failed, largely due to the interventions by Alexander Hamilton in 1804, in 1800, and 1797. Again, Jerry Therrien's writings go through a lot of this stuff. I encourage people to look at that. So Robert Livingston took a very keen interest in the arts. And by asking why weren't the arts developing, why wasn't this new revolutionary school of aesthetics developing, one has to look at this group. John Trumbull was a good artist, a very talented artist, but he was the only artist who was part of this founding group in New York. Other people included James Pinchot, Thomas Clark, Ogden Haggerty, who were leading speculators and Federalists who, again, were all part of this conspiracy, this anti-American conspiracy. And what they wanted to do is essentially monetize the arts. It was used in some ways for money laundering, not that different from how the arts have been increasingly used in the last century in the West. And they weren't artists. They didn't really care about the arts. So a battle broke out. The only types of arts that they created a market for, where they ensured that money was going to go to, was in portraiture. So if you wanted to be an artist and you wanted to get by, you had to be pretty much a portrait painter. The problem is it's limited. You can do a lot of beautiful things with a portrait, but the domain of expressing creativity, the imagination in simply portraits by themselves is very limited. So they ensure that people had to conform as painters to that aesthetic, or maybe banality, certain banal pictures of, a cow on a field, or something that didn't really contain ideas. So you don't see a lot of inspiring paintings during this time. We have one of the close friends of Samuel Morse, who's William Dunlop, and he wrote a book called The History on the Rise of Progress of the Arts of Design in the United States. He was the vice president of the National Academy of the Arts of Design that was set up in New York by Samuel Morse as the president, who remained president until 1845. So from 1826 to 1845, Morse was the president. Dunlop was vice president, and immediately this organization completely went to war with the Anglophile monetarist dictatorship of the arts. William describes this organization the following way. He says, the Academy of Fine Arts was a joint stock company composed of persons of every trade and profession who thought the privilege of visiting the exhibition an equivalent for $20 fine dollars, or it's supposed to be $25. Such persons were the electors of the directors and entitled to be themselves elected directors. Artists could only share those privileges by purchasing stocks, and might be controlled in everything respecting their profession by those who were ignorant of the arts. That's just a quick overview. So what happened? This is extraordinarily interesting, because when when Morse and Dunlop create this different organization, they began attracting a lot of talent, a lot of students who were feeling very stifled in the former organization in New York. And again, New York was sort of just like today, it was the cultural zone of the United States. So they were tired of being having their creativity crushed. They wanted freedom of expression. They wanted to be able to actually make money and showcase their artwork as well, which was not happening so much in the other organization. And they wanted a school also to teach and transmit their skills. So they all were very attracted and joined immediately Morse's new organization, the Academy of the Arts of Design. There were 30 of them, including Thomas Cole, Asher B. Durand, many others. I have a big list. And when you Google some of the names and look at the paintings quality, it's quite astounding. Now, there was a battle back and forth between these two organizations for quite some time. And originally there was an attempt at a compromise where John Trumbull and Robert Livingston's organization tried to say, okay, well, we'll let you in. We'll give the artists a chance to be on the boards of directors. They just have to put in $100 and we'll let them in. But then when the time came to actually follow through on the promise, they actually didn't follow through. So they said, okay, we'll only let 2 artists in. We don't want to sully it with too many. We want experts still running the show. And they blocked all of the other young painters from having a deciding role to play in anything. So at that point, Morse and Dunlop basically said, forget about it. And a series of public debates happened that ensued, which are extraordinary debates just to see the paradigms of the arts clashing of the British and the American philosophy. So John Trumbull, in his oration against Samuel Morse in public, he spoke, and this is a recorded part of the speech where he says, "It appears to me that the Academy of Design requires the abolition of the stockholders of this academy, as the basis of the negotiation, the sine qua non, on their part of a union. You will permit me to state at large the reasons why I regard this basis as utterly inadmissible. It has been proven by all experience, and indeed it is a truism, that the arts cannot flourish without patronage in some form. It is manifest that artists cannot interchangeably purchase the works of each other and prosper. They are necessarily dependent upon the protection of the rich and the great. In the country where there is no sovereign, who can establish and endow academies as Louis XIV did in Paris and in Rome, or as the late George III did in London? And in case of want of success in their early efforts to aid them, as the latter monarch aided the Academy of London by a gift from the privy purse to the amount of £5,000. So he's basically saying, we need the rich. You can't get by without the rich. And he's, of course, justifying, again, the rich Wall Street stock jobbers who were, again, just using the arts for speculation and other things. 1 second. Okay. So in response to this, Samuel B. Morse, I've got a longer quote, but it's so good I couldn't just take a smaller portion of it out. But he really lays down the gauntlet, and this is a real death blow to John Trumbull's entire argument, where Samuel B. Morse says, "All this is as true of authors as of artists. Now let me ask any of the authors what kind of patronage he seeks from the rich and from the great. What what sort of dependence he has on them for protection in this country, since there is no sovereign to whom he can look for protection, no aristocracy on which he can depend for patronage. Is there a man of independent feelings, of whatever profession he may be, who does not feel disgust at language like this? And is it to be supposed that the artists of the country are so behind the sentiments of their countrymen as not to spurn any patronage or protection that takes such a shape as this? The artist, poor helpless thing, must learn to bow and bow in the halls and antechambers of my lord, implore his lordship's protection, advertise himself painter to his majesty or his royal highness, boast over his fellows, because he has his grace for his patron, and think himself well off if he may be permitted to come in at the back door of his patron's gallery. If there are artists who desire to be so protected and so dependent, it is a free country, and there is room for all, every man to his taste. But artists of the National Academy of Design have some sense of character to be deadened, some pride of profession to be humbled, some aspiring after excellence in art to be brought down, some of the independent spirit of their country to lose. before they can be bent to the purpose of such an anti-republican institution as the Academy of Fine Arts. In making these remarks on the language and sentiments of the address by Mr. Trumbull, I disclaim identifying them with those of the stockholders of the American Academy of Fine Arts. I know not that there are any who have imbibed such degrading notions of the arts, or such contemptuous opinions of artists. If there are, we wish them to rally around just such a tree as the sentiments of the address would nurture. We believe that our climate is uncongenial to the growth of such an aristocratic plant, and that the public will not be long in deciding whether such an institution or the National Academy of Design is most in harmony with the independent character of the country. And he won. He just completely straight out won the case. And within a matter of months, John Trumbull and Livingston's British Arts Academy just disintegrated. Nobody wanted to be a part of it. And and instead, so what they ended up getting was a very new institution that gave birth to a completely new school of painting. And like I mentioned the name Thomas Cole. I wasn't going to go through these, but I just want to show a few examples of the sort of school of painting that did arise out of this. Just to show people very quickly, I think I'm going to do another class just on the Hudson River School and its rise for 50 years. But this is Albert Bierstadt's. This is Thomas Cole's, one of the segments of a series of paintings on the course of life. This is another one by Frederick Church on the Cotopaxi. Again, just showcasing how you can have a strong poetic imagery impressed in a landscape, which is more than simply the sum of the totality of the images in front of your eyeballs. Because just by simply contrasting two different qualities of heat and light, one from the sun, one from this very destructive force of nature of the volcano, you can definitely express a variety of universal sentiments, right? Things that are transcendental of the ephemeral emotions that we just experience by our day-to-day experience of, I want coffee today. I'm so disappointed that my show is a repeat or whatever. Those forms of emotion are very different from the universal sentiments that people like Schiller or von Humboldt discuss. And that's really always the focus of the Hudson River School paintings of, in this case, hope being signified in one aspect, even though the fear of the temporal destruction of a volcano, which is a very scary thing, is just juxtaposed right next to it. So, this whole school arose directly out of Samuel Morse's academy. So let me get back to the slideshow here. So yeah, and I think I'm going to have to deliver a separate lecture just again on this school and its philosophy and the battles that were waged, how it was undermined as well, because it didn't continue on into the 20th century. Why not? The creation of an American Renaissance movement. Okay, so how does Samuel B. Morse really go about throwing down the gauntlet and showcasing what this new school can do and inspire in talent and in the population? America didn't have very many museums. There wasn't a lot of access to Renaissance paintings. You couldn't go and just see a Raphael very easily in America as a farmer or, so you couldn't do that. So what did he do? In 1831, he spent several months doing something that had never been done before. Samuel B. Morse spends a lot of time in the Louvre. And he basically wants to bring something back to the United States that will give people a museum unto itself. And this is a giant tableau. And in it, what we have featured are 37 pieces of artwork by the greatest artists, the things that he found the most sublime and influential within the Louvre, including, you obviously see the little Mona Lisa. We have paintings by Titian, by Velasquez, by Raphael, the Madonna. There's just so many, and many, many more. You also have several students, people living and breathing in the actual hall in the painting, who are themselves learning how to paint, right? Painting students. So you have this entire barrage. Again, 37. Nobody had ever done anything like this, and to this very day, it's renowned for being so adherent to the styles, the essence of each of the paintings that he's copying. They're not perfect, but he's able to just to change gears and really express the dignity and the style of each of the great masters. I'm going to just focus in on a few elements of this because I just think it's kind of like what Raphael Sanzio does with the School of Athens in so many ways, you know, because this room does exist, the salle carrée of the Louvre. It is a room that does exist. However, none of the paintings are in that room, nor have they ever been in that room. These are all paintings that that Morse copied and put in that room. As an artist, see, you don't have to just be a realist, and people poo-poo realism in many ways because they say, oh, this deadens your creativity. It binds you to what your senses show. And no, that's not true at all. You don't have to just go into abstract, the other anti-realist extreme to express creativity or thoughts that are transcendental to your senses. You don't have to do that. So he's exhibiting one of many approaches to resolving that paradox. Because again, none of these paintings are there, but also these people, just like in Raphael's School of Athens, none of these philosophers really lived in the time that they were being painted. They didn't live at the same time temporally, and yet Raphael was able to put in various clusters of dialogues that were occurring in the School of Athens in the Vatican, these various thinkers, stretching from Plato and Aristotle in the center to Socrates, who died before Aristotle, to we have Pythagoras, we got Anaxagoras, we got Raphael himself, who's actually in there. And in that sense, again, we have something similar that Morse himself does here. So what do we have of the people? We have James Fenimore Cooper, who was one of the leading members of the American artistic movement and intelligentsia. He innovated an entire new literary school of the written word, not just the Last of the Mohicans and leather stocking tales, but he also did he wrapped intelligence insights, like in the Bravo, on the nature of Venice and the structure of the political systems of Venice and of Europe, and contrasted that to the Republican cultures and political systems of the West. So there's an entire body of rich work and insights that he was able to create. And he was a sponsor, like I said, of Samuel B. Morse, the painter. And he was one of the catalyzers who brought him to France at this very strategic point in world history. What we have there is Cooper and his wife standing next to him with their daughter, Susan Cooper, who's she was a renowned painter. I'll say something more about her in a second. We have there, just as I said, Raphael Sanzio couldn't help but insert himself into the School of Athens near, I think it was Ptolemy. But we have also Samuel Morse, who's giving an art lesson to his daughter, right there in the center. We have in the background, I'm forgetting the name of one of Samuel Morse's leading friends and sculptors who was part of this artistic network in Europe. I'm forgetting his name, but anyway, who's just beginning to walk into the La Salle Carrée. We have there Richard Habershon, who's an American painter and sculptor who is he was living with Samuel B. Morse during a couple of years when they were working in France. And there we have Lucretia Morse. Lucretia Morse is Samuel B. Morse's wife. Now, just as I said that in the School of Athens, not everybody lived at the same time, indeed, the same thing applies to this painting as well. Lucretia Morse had herself died at the age of 26 in 1825 or 26, 4 or 5 years before this painting was being done. So this is an homage to his late wife and the mother of his 3 children, who herself, she did love painting. Similarly, his friend James Fenimore Cooper's daughter, Susan Cooper, had died 2 years earlier. So this is also an homage to his friend's daughter. So you have, again, a certain simultaneity of eternity, right? That people are in participating in immortal ideas, in their love of immortal ideas, are themselves living in a higher level of time that transcends the ephemeral time that changes moment to moment. And just like we are here today, 180 years later, looking back and thinking about this painting, I'm not going to go through a dissection of the individual paintings. That's worth looking at and thinking about. And there's actually a website I'll include that has little titles of each one of the paintings, and you can look at it and Google and think about what each painter is trying to convey within each one, using color, using light, using the stories from the Bible or ancient Greek classics or their own times to convey certain ideas that are, again, more than the sum of the parts. That's always the case with these classical paintings. There's two questions that arise. Why is he in France? And why does he pick this subject? I think I've said partially pretty well why he picked the subject. Up until then, people in Europe had only really, who hadn't been to the Louvre, only had a chance to really know of the Louvre by a superstar painting that had just been made public. Thousands and thousands of people had paid money to see this painting in 1831, right before Morse starts painting his painting. We have something else that had just been produced, and this is by a French artist named Nicola Sebastien Mayo. Most of the paintings are pretty unintelligible. It also features the same room. These were paintings that were actually in the room. The room was the French room, so it was devoted to French paintings. The only painting that's the center of it that's really intelligible is the Raft of the Medusa. The Raft of the Medusa was a painting, if you Google it and look at it, it's a painting of despair. There's not really any hope. Like, you know, when we looked at the Frederick Church painting of the volcano and the sunrise, you have a certain sense of hope that after the despair of the destruction of the volcano, a day will rise again, the sun will continue on, right? In the Raft of the Medusa, you have pretty much dead bodies being eaten by rats on a raft, that a shipwreck at sea, and there's not really a lot of hope. It's really a very cynical painting. And the general style was really a nouveau style that was being innovated by a series of painters in France. And Morse just found this to be emblematic of some major tragedies in history, and some tragedies that were happening at his time in France, which also is part of the key, the master key of why he was there. Why was he in France? What was the problem of France's failure, of the culture's failure, of the masses' failure, as well as the failure of the elites to do something that needed to happen? This takes us into a second component of Morse's identity as a universal figure and somebody who participated directly in world history. So, okay, do people know who this figure is on the screen? Not Jerry. People could take their mics off mute if there's no background noise, by the way. Feel free to not be on mute. I don't mind.
Lafayette.
Lafayette. Who said Lafayette? That was Patrick.
Lafayette.
All right, Patrick. Yes. Point for Patrick. Marquis de Lafayette. This was a painting that Samuel B Morse was commissioned to do when Lafayette was in the United States. What is Lafayette famous for? Patrick, you're on a roll. Or Assad.
Could you repeat the question?
I said, what is Marquis de Lafayette famous for?
The general.
Famous for? Oh, but he was famous for he brings the French army to help the American Revolution.
Correct. So Lafayette was an instrumental figure in the equation of the success of the American Revolution that was orchestrated by Benjamin Franklin, who was the ambassador in France during the Revolution and had huge networks in the intelligentsia, and was able to orchestrate an alliance where France was able to come in 1779 and tip the balance in favor of the Americans against the British Empire. Was a deciding factor, and Lafayette was one of the first earliest young men at the age of only, I think, 18 or 19 who came in and offered his services even before the alliance. He was that gung-ho and believed in the cause. So he's part of the nobility, but he also had a disdain for a part of the nobility and a love for Republican principles of self-government. This put him in a very interesting position because when he returned to France, in order to continue the movement that was supposed to go on beyond the American colonies, but was supposed to spread to erase hereditary institutions from Europe, beginning with France in 1789, he did well on a certain level at first, but he, as much as he hated these elitist aristocratic cultural controls, he also kind of loved them. It was something he couldn't break with fully, and that caused him to make some bad decisions that he became well known for. But he was also, by virtue of being the youngest, he was also by the 1820s the last real active living leader of the American Revolution. He was more than just so he had a certain role to play, and he was also a leading figure within the International Society of Cincinnati and the Philosophical Society, which is an internationally expanded organization that was created by Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton created the Society of Cincinnati as a coordinating body globally that stretched all the way throughout Europe, Germany, Spain, to the United States. Even members of Russia, Poland were part of it. So Marquis de Lafayette was the leader of that, and if there was going to be a second chance at an American Revolution, he was going to be the leader of it, of undoing the non-revolution that happened in 1789 when it became a Jacobin bloodbath and a color revolution run by British intelligence for 5 years, which resulted in a vacuum of leadership in Napoleon. Lafayette only survived and only saved his head by running off to Austria at a certain moment, and lived out the rest of that revolution in a dungeon for 5 years. Beethoven's Fidelio was an homage to this story. That's another class unto itself. So Marquis de Lafayette had a very big role to play. The United States was a key part of his plans to have another attempt at creating a republic in France, and then the rest of Europe would follow. So he was in America. He was in for many months. He traveled. He organized for the presidency of John Quincy Adams, who did actually end up winning in those elections by a matter of 1 vote. So he really did tip the balance in favor of the nationalists in opposition to the Wall Street crowd. But he was also organizing. He was going everywhere, meeting with the leaders of the rebellion that later became called the Rebellion of the Patriots of Upper Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie, who met with Marquis de Lafayette for several days during this period. Cooper, we had many people. Edgar Allan Poe, a young Poe, met with the Marquis de Lafayette, who was also part of the Society of Cincinnati. And a lot of these figures, including Cooper and Morse, ended up following Lafayette to France, where, so anyway, I'll say something more about that in a sec. So when Cooper acquires the contract for Morse to paint Lafayette, he embeds several ideas, ironies into it. So do people see anything special about this portrait that's being communicated? Is there anything weird that you see about this that you wouldn't normally see in another portrait, or any anomalies that you see popping out at you?
The dark clouds.
There are dark clouds on one side and light in the sun on his right side that he's looking at, but there are dark, ominous clouds indeed. Very much so. Is there anything else?
Those dark clouds could be the baggage of his aristocratic upbringing, but he's looking at the light in that he supports the American Revolution, and he has a love of Republican principles. But there's a certain kernel of his aristocratic tendencies that he just can't shake off. Is that what you're trying to get at?
I think that's a valid hypothesis, what you're saying right there.
What are the busts? The busts are of who?
Do people recognize those two busts?
One looks like Franklin, but one stands in the light and one stands in darkness.
Washington.
You got it. Washington and Ben Franklin are looking at him. Yeah. So definitely they're on the side of where the sunlight is coming from, and sort of looking at him almost in judgment, or what are you going to do, right? Like, look at Benjamin Franklin's eyes, his face. As far as I know, there is no bust in existence of Ben Franklin in that facial expression. that's something that Morse created. And there's almost like the typical sort of Roman, Greco-Roman bust we see in George Washington's disposition, this austere dignity. You don't really have that with Ben Franklin's bust. His facial expression is much more uncertain, or those eyebrows are up. There's a certain smirk on his face.
A certain irony in his thinking.
It reminded me a little bit of Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer by Rembrandt, where Homer is just got this look, even though he's blind, he's got this look of like ambiguity on his face, just shock or surprise on his face. There's a certain ambiguity, at least.
Matt, can I throw in a navigator observation?
Yeah, do it.
Okay, so if you think about maps and charts in the Northern Hemisphere, north is up, south is down, east is to your right, west is to your left. So if I look towards the left of this painting, it looks like the marquee is looking towards the west, and I could almost equate that to sunset with the way the lighting and the clouds works. So he's looking towards the west, looking towards America, where those two famous Americans are. I'm just guessing, it seems to me that that's part of what you're talking about, but there's the geographic, if you will, context. It sort of matches what you're describing.
I like that. I like that theory. I mean, you can't say that it's not the sunrise and it is the sunset, but I think that your theory is solid. I like it.
So it's old world looking towards new world.
Yeah, that would be a nice way of looking at it. I think it's a plausible thing. I wouldn't want to throw that idea away at all. I think also something that struck me is his body's posture. Because is he walking, or is he leaning on? Is he fixed? Is he stationary?
Isn't that a Masonic sort of foot alignment?
I wouldn't worry about that right now.
Okay.
I can't really say too much about that in the current context of this painting, because I've stood like that as well, and I'm not a Mason. But I would ask though, is as far as his whole body's posture, do people think that he's in a state of motion, or is it a stationary pose?
Stay in motion.
My impulse was to say motion, but then if you look at it, you're like, well, wait a minute, you're really in motion. Those 2 feet are firmly planted on the ground. It's not like one is higher up, and his right hand sort of stationed right on that pillar is not the sort of thing you would do if you were walking either. So there seems to be an ambiguity between motion and no motion that's being communicated also.
The feet are aligned, so they're prepared for motion, but that hand is definitely fixed.
Yeah, exactly. So again, you have the contrast of motion and non-motion, kind of like what we saw with Raphael's dispute between Plato and Aristotle, right? Where one figure is obviously stationary and the other one is obviously in a state of motion, pointing to the sky. So again, you have this juxtaposition, this time a little bit more advanced because it's combined in one figure instead. Which again, I think is knowing what everybody in the world, this is not a theory about Marquis de Lafayette's confusion about his aristocratic principles and his love for republicanism. That was not something that's a theory. Everybody kind of knew that, and they were all hoping he could resolve it finally, because everyone was disappointed watching the 1789 tragedy unfold in France. They're like, don't do this again.
Also, look at Lafayette, his right hand versus his left hand. His right hand staying on the surface where the two busts are.
Yeah.
Facing west, where you have a blue sky, and then you have the left hand that's like kind of hidden. It's shaded. It's like a darker color, like he's trying to hide. It kind of looks like someone might be trying to hide something, like
maybe.
Yeah. Maybe like a weapon or something.
Maybe it's possible. All right, so let's see where this goes. So I'm going to skip this quote. That's another study he did of Marquis Lafayette's face. Again, I think his eyes. There's a certain uncertainty.
Yeah,
it's not your typical portrait choice of facial expression either. There's something interesting about that as well. Also, I want to just say I really want to thank some of the research that I'm drawing upon here was not all me. I mean, a lot of this was done by this historian named Pierre Baudry and Patrick Ruckert from the United States, who have published some amazing works on these two individuals and this period of history. So I really have to thank them for the work that they're doing and that I'm sharing with you. And I'm inserting some of my own ideas as well. I'm not just being a copycat, but I really have to thank them for this stuff. by 1829, when he goes with Cooper, and we have other figures who find themselves, like I said, in France, including Washington Irving, who Assad introduced us to a little bit the other week, the great writer who was also ambassador of Spain, who was there in Europe. But we had Edgar Poe, we had Samuel Greeley Howe, who was the one of the leading doctors of America, who founded the schools of Braille that gave rise later on to Anne Frank and Anne Sullivan. Not Anne Frank, Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan, who were all part of this amazing network. And Cooper, Morse, and Lafayette all lived several doors down from each other during the entire several-year period that something was happening that I'm going to say something more about. So they would spend evenings together, working together, playing music together. Morse played the flute and Cooper played the piano. Lafayette was in these soiree musicabends frequently, but they were doing more than just simply enjoying and socializing. So what was happening? There were 3 days of riots called the Three Glorious Days, where the repercussions of the Carlsbad Decrees of 1819 and the 1815 Congress of Vienna were really coming home to roost. So after the Napoleonic Wars, which again were all entirely the effect of Lafayette's failure to accept becoming the president when he had the chance after the tennis court oath in 1789, he had a chance to just say, okay, the time is right, people are ready to move. I will declare I will be the president as people want me to be of the new republic. He chose not to do it, and he chose to try to keep an alliance between a democracy with a republican monarchy with King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He tried to keep his loyalties intact. He couldn't do it. It was irreconcilable. So by his failure to act accordingly, it not only was the monarchy wiped out in France there, but you had the basically all of his leading allies, Lavoisier, the allies of Benjamin Franklin, the scientists, the artists, Janssen Vebey were all killed. Their heads were cut off, and the 20-year Napoleonic Wars were the direct. I mean, these things were being funded by the Rothschild bankers, the same bankers that were funding both the British, the Wellington side, as well as the Napoleonic side. They were just running a global chaos operation to basically ensure that no more Republican fervor was going to happen, just cause a scorched earth policy to unfold. And when finally Napoleon's reign had ended, and you had what was called the Congress of Vienna, or the Holy Alliance of several imperial powers of Europe, under Lord Metternich, Lord Castlereagh of the British Foreign Office, and several others, like the Spanish Habsburg, that basically united and said, okay, we can't let this happen again. Let's just create a new policy of banning all ideas that are dangerous. So you had a total dictatorship in the arts. Books were banned. You couldn't read Schiller. You couldn't read Thomas Paine. You had dictators stationed in every single school, censors in every publishing house that ensured that no dangerous ideas would be accepted. Professors who chose to not obey were promptly expelled and forbidden to work. Which is why you had a lot of leading Republican thinkers and scientists emerge in America from Germany during this period. But the stifling situation across Europe, and especially in France, resulted in sort of a backlash. And in 1829, in July, you had 3 days of riots. And the positions were being put in place where Lafayette was being set up to emerge as the president, to declare himself the president of the republic, and get rid of the Bourbon presidency, the Bourbon kingship under Charles X, and just basically correct the problem of 1789. So what happens? He has a discussion on the balcony the day that he's about to speak in front of crowds of tens and tens of thousands of people, which among the crowd included Cooper. Morse was there, shouting for President Lafayette to come to the balcony and declare himself the leader. He had a discussion with the Duke of Orleans, the son of Philippe d'Égalité, who was one of the key players in the First Color Revolution decades earlier. And they came to a very tragic arrangement. And this is recounted by France's great transport minister under Sadi Carnot from the 1890s, Gabriel Hanito, and he was also a renowned historian. And Hannetot describes a dialogue between the two before Lafayette comes out, and the Duke of Orleans and him speak. And Lafayette says, "You know that I am a Republican and that I consider the Constitution of the United States as the most perfect that ever existed." "I think you do," replied the Duke of Orleans. "It is impossible to have lived 2 years in the United States and not be of that opinion. But do you believe that in the situation that France is in, and following public opinion, it would be right to adopt it?" "No," replied Lafayette. "What the French people need today is a popular monarchy surrounded by Republican institutions, completely Republican." "That is precisely what I intend to do," said the prince. Seems trustworthy, right? So that's an illustration of what followed, where Lafayette came to the balcony and proclaimed the new king, the new Duke of Orleans, the king of France. And they did sort of a horse trade for one king for another. And he was told Lafayette would be the head of the guard, of the National Guard, which he was for about 5 minutes before being fired. And at that moment, the French king immediately set up an alliance with Britain, the British Empire, and did everything all over again. So pretty much it went back to business as usual, and France and Britain, the Anglo-French alliance, ran roughshod over the world really until today. I mean, it's been an ongoing thing. So Lafayette had also written earlier to his wife in 1792 saying, "You know that my heart would have been Republican if my reason had not given me a nuance of royalism." What kind of loser thing is that to say? So, and that's a picture of him in 1789 kissing the hand of Marie Antoinette when he really should have been declaring himself president, which he couldn't bring himself to do.
I just have a question about asking questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Comment. I mean, are you gonna open this up for? I guess there'll be a discussion on these things at the end. I have a lot of thoughts on this particular idea. I think there's a lot that can be said about that.
So here's what we can do. I'm realizing now it's been about 55 minutes of me speaking, and I'm about to enter a transitionary period. What I could do is open it up for dialogue and end the class here, and then go for part 2 of the follow-up of the class in a few days, either before Anton or after Anton gives his lecture next week, or we could just pummel through and get the whole thing done in it'll be another hour of me speaking. So I don't know.
What's the meat of the second hour?
The meat of the second hour is, here, tell you what, I'll show you the meat of the second hour, okay? Here it is. So going back to Samuel B Morse, this is right after he sets up his Academy of Design, and the British Academy has been annihilated. He writes a manifesto describing what will he model it on, what are we going to model it on, and he says the plan for exhibitions as it exists in the English Royal Academy is that which we have adopted, as better suited to our state of society than those of the continental academies. We have taken the English Royal Academy for our model, as far as the different circumstances of form of government and state of taste will admit.
Okay, wait.
What is he talking about? How would this anti-monarchist, anti-royalist, fervent Republican, humanist, why would he model his new academy for the arts that's just destroyed this other royal, monetarist academy? Why would he want to model it on the British Royal Academy?
Well, is it because you're saying that there was among the elite this different art, right? There was different art for different classes, and so he's saying we want the art, what art is good for royalty is actually good for everybody. Unlike,
if you look at what the royalty tended to think was popular for most of Europe's history, and especially in his time, for the most part, it really wasn't that great. But you're touching on something, because there was a movement in Europe. I didn't mention that he actually trained as a painter in England, that Samuel B Morse was one of many students who trained in England for several years during the War of 1812 under a figure in England who was the president of the Royal Academy. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Now this is where I don't know if I want to make this a separate class next week or not. So what are we looking at here? This is a painting from 1795 of the Royal Academicians. In the center is the president of the British Royal Academy. These are all of the different artists from the British Royal Academy. The individual in the center was the teacher of Samuel B Morse. Does anybody know who this person is? Okay, I know Jerry knows, and Madeline probably knows too.
The teacher of Samuel B Morse, you're saying, is at the center?
Yeah, he's the president of the British Royal Academy. One of the key founders of the British Royal Academy too.
I don't know.
Okay, that's Benjamin West. What makes him so anomalous is that Benjamin West is a leading painter of the world, born in 1737 or 1738, who's a Quaker born in Pennsylvania. He's a Quaker born in Pennsylvania, never completely self-taught, never had any formal training. He actually learned how to paint because his family was very integrated. They were neighbors with various Delaware natives. And they taught him to paint using clay and bear grease from the lake, near the lake nearby his house. And that's how he learned how to paint. And he quickly found himself in the same networks that were created by Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Philosophical Society. His father was a very close friend of Ben Franklin, and in 1751 or 52, his father, who was he ran a boarding house. His building was the first building to ever put a lightning rod on it as the first test building. When he was brought into England, I mean, there were patrons, friends of Ben Franklin, who saw the man's talents. His family didn't actually, or his community didn't want to let him paint because the Quakers, the strict Quakers that they came from, basically saw all forms of the arts as being corrupting because they woke passions, and passions were dangerous. So they had to have an emergency meeting for what do you do with this kid who has obvious talent. And they had a long drawn out meeting all night long where they finally discussed, well, if God gave him this skill, and even though we agree that painting has tended to be something which is that doesn't make you a better person, who's to say it can't make you a better person? And they had an enlightened decision to say, well, maybe he's the one who can bring painting to another level where it can make people better. And some of Ben Franklin's friends sponsored his voyage after seeing his painting of Socrates, The Last Days of Socrates, Taking the Hemlock, which it was his first sort of big painting in America. It's not that good, but it's an interesting thing to choose to do as a teenager. They basically sponsored his voyage to France, to Italy, where he studied the great classics, the masters. And after 2 years of doing that, he was going to take a little bit of a sojourn to London. And he caught the attention of some very interesting people, including one of the advisors of King George III himself. And quickly rose and did some things that nobody realizes. I mean, today, I think this has really been obscured from history books. And the experts of Benjamin West that I've seen, and I've listened to some lectures, they're not only very arrogant, but their arrogance on Benjamin West, the tone of their disdain in their voice when they speak of him is only matched by their hate of Benjamin. They really hate Benjamin West. These are the experts, the authorities on Benjamin West, who've written all of the Cambridge Press books on him. You know, it's very interesting to listen to. But I have a whole series of paintings and a whole story about Benjamin West. Okay, I could do this in 40 minutes. Do people have 40 minutes to give?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
John, you're a busy man. I'm going to base it on your schedule. What do you say?
I prefer you continue.
Okay, I'll continue. Maria, and anybody in Europe, I am so sorry, guys. I know it's super late. I'm so sorry. Okay, so let's just do this. Okay, so Ben West. So, all right, that's a 1790s portrait of Benjamin West. That's actually a self-portrait. just like many of these great poets, painters, they tend to explore their own soul a lot, and they don't do it in the most boring of ways. One anomaly, and I think Benjamin West is a painter of anomalies. You have to look for the ironies always, just like Morse, and he taught his students. Not all of them followed this advice, but a lot of them did, to embed ironies, visual ironies, that will sit as splinters in the mind of your audience, and that if it's pursued in the mind, because it sticks there, will create insights into nature and into ourselves. Here's one anomaly. Okay, I said he likes doing portraits. This is a young portrait from 1770, just when he had arrived in Britain. He'd been there for a few years. He just recently received the patronage of King George III. At this point, he was becoming he was a founding member of the British Royal Academy that had just been set up in 1769, and he does this painting of himself. But then 6 years later, he does another painting of himself that looks remarkably familiar. This is in 1776. This is several weeks after George III had received the Declaration of Independence and the war had officially really gotten underway. Why would he do this? What's the same and what is different between these two paintings separated by 7 years? Does anything pop out, guys?
What's with that thing that's hanging that's ripped? I can't tell what I'm actually looking at.
In the first one or the second one?
The second one, like what is
the background?
Yeah, there's like a thing that looks ripped, but doesn't look.
In the background, you just have a hanging. It's like a curtain. Don't worry about it. Oh, on his left. Oh, on your left side, I'm not sure what that is. It might be either a cloud, or a tree silhouette, or I'm not sure. I don't.
The composition of whatever he's holding completely changed from one painting to the next.
Whoever said that is remarkably diligent. Yes, whatever he's holding just completely changed. What is he what is in his hand here? What is he holding?
At first glance, it seemed like a canvas.
It is a canvas.
Yeah,
with a rag.
On the second, okay. On the second, it no longer looks like a canvas anymore.
It is still a canvas and it's still a rag, but the difference is in the first one, the rag has nothing on it, and in the second one, there's definitely something there. Right?
Well, I can't tell what that is.
I couldn't tell what it was either. It took a really long time for me to figure it out.
It's like a human figure.
Definitely a human figure. Yeah. You could even say there might be two human
small.
figures
It's
there.
really hard to see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hold that in your mind. Okay, that's one thing, one major anomaly. I would say anything else?
With the Lafayette painting, it seems like the light comes from the left or arguably the west, if there's any truth to that, although it's just speculation. But the overall tone is darker overall in the second one, the later one.
Yes, that's true. Sometimes it's hard to say these things because when you're looking at a painting, you're often it's being affected by the camera that's taking the picture of the painting or the scan. So it's hard to get like the actual painting itself and the actual color tones and lightness. But definitely there's a change in light. I mean,
before talking about the change between the two paintings, is not worth maybe just talking about what's even in one of them first. And like, I mean, for me, the thing that sticks out is the darkness in the hat. You know, part of his head is covered. There's this, you know, there's like a giant abyss or something unknown at the top of his head. You know, it's sort of creating this black, shadowy thing. So I mean, that stands out. That seems pretty.
It's an object that stands out in the eye. Yeah.
Something is hidden. Something is seen. No.
Maybe, but that doesn't really have a lot of structure to the anomaly. It's just sort of it's an observation that you're making, but without more information, we can't say that there's more to it. Definitely, the darkness and the light behind him might have some sort of communication or an idea there. Maybe.
The chair changes.
The chair changes. That's another thing that changes. Yeah.
I mean, is that a native figure or something?
We're going to find that out in a second. I would say one thing that, what about his eyes? Is there a difference in
His
emotion
eyes look a
and
little,
wisdom?
his eyes look darker in the second one.
Yeah, they're
Like,
darker. Is there something in the emotional state?
And they're more wary and weary, like tired in the second one. Whereas in the first one, it's kind of like wide-eyed and.
Yeah, exactly. I found that's what I found too. He had a more naive. There's a naive sort of expression from the eyes in the first one.
He was younger, and in the second, he's seen everything. Oh, I'm just tired. I'm kind of tired of things. I don't know if that's really the right way to interpret.
Definitely more wise. I think he's definitely seen things. Yeah, he's not as naive as he used to be. That's for sure.
Not as naive as he was.
Yeah, and I think there's something to do with the pulling of his tight collar as well. These things were pretty suffocating, and especially for an American who you didn't have to wear these things. It wasn't customary to have these like tight, polite collars in America. I think his pulling on it is sort of it might be read as like a sign that it's kind of tight. It's kind of like not my culture that's making me do it.
This is England at the time.
Yeah.
Spent time in England.
That's a very British style, very British thing to do. Yeah. So he spends his whole life in Britain, right? He lives out his life. He never goes back to America, and he's called a traitor for this by Americans who lived through the Revolution. He's attacked as an American traitor, and ironically, he's also attacked by the British for being an American spy. That might be a bit more true. So what is that thing that we saw on the? Oh my God, what is happening here? Whoops, sorry. You're getting a. What was on the rag? So what we have there is a painting 6 years before his second portrait in 1776. He did a painting called The Death of General Wolfe. Does anybody recognize the two figures on the right? Do those two figures and those two figures on the right side of the painting and those two figures on the rag look at all familiar?
Yeah, the little there. Well, I like to say it's that priest or cleric saying on the right, on the right side of this painting, standing next to the man in the red coat.
Yeah. Well, what you have here.
This is the Battle of Quebec, right?
That's the Battle of Quebec, yeah, in 1859. And that's the Death of General Wolfe, the painting. Now, those two figures are actually the two figures here on the right side of the painting. The guy praying and the other guy, where both guys are praying, looking at General Wolfe's last moments before he passes away.
Okay.
So he's saying something about this moment, this painting he did 6 years earlier, showcasing an event that happened 12 years earlier across the Atlantic Ocean. And the fact that he's doing this in 1776 is not a coincidence either. Now, Benjamin West he's most famous for his history paintings. He was a history painter, and that's what many of his students became as well. He believed that he had a philosophy of history painting, that your society will value the memories that it has, and the purpose of the painter is to convey those moments of society's collective past and enshrine them in such a way that universal lessons of who we are will be learned. Okay, so what else do we have here? What would have been important historically in this moment? So this is a Battle of Quebec at the Plains of Abraham. The French had just lost, but as much as the French had just lost, General Wolfe, who was a young man, had also died at that battle. This was a strategic moment because at this moment, this was the decisive moment that the French Empire lost its stranglehold in North America, giving the ability for Benjamin Franklin's networks to organize one revolution at a time, because they had already been planning out the conditions of declaring independence that would only manifest in 1775. But as part of this sequence, everyone had understood that Quebec, after it it fell to the British, and the Quebecois had almost unanimous consent that the British were tyrants. They didn't like the British in general. They didn't like the British Empire, but they got along very well with the other colonists, the other 13 colonies. So everyone understood that Quebec was going to be the 14th member of signing the Declaration of Independence. That was pretty well understood, and that's why Benjamin Franklin put so much of his work into going up to Quebec in 1774 to organize the elites and the people to be a part of it. However, certain games were played that ensured that, and certain bribes were done that ensured that that did not happen, as we know, and history unfolded a different way. But this was a very deciding moment, and it also features something that most British historians chose to ignore, which is that at this very battle, you had William Johnson. See, there's a figure here who was not actually at the death of General Wolfe, or even who wasn't anywhere near General Wolfe dying. In fact, hardly any of these characters who we see in front of our eyes were actually there when General Wolfe died. See, General Wolfe, he got shot and he died behind a bush with like 2 other people in attendance. So Benjamin West chose to organize his composition in a very different way. This fellow here, William Johnson, is a very special person to both Benjamin West as well as to the entire battle of history, because, I mean, this guy is not your typical, he was an Irishman. He moved to America, to New York in 1738, and he didn't play by the typical British stuffy customs or rules. He did things very differently, but very effectively when he started organizing treaties with the natives and working with the natives, with the Six Nations, the Mohawks, and the Iroquois. He's a figure who's definitely standing out, right? Because while all of the other British soldiers and officers have one disposition, this guy is integrated very much culturally with the native. He's got the native stockings, moccasins. He's renowned for being somebody who completely respected the native culture. He learned several different native dialects, and by 1742, he was made a Mohawk civil chief. He was made the colonel of Six Nation Mohawks. The Mohawks requested that he be the representative of the British to them because they couldn't work with anybody else. Nobody else respected. They just treated them like savages, pretty much. They didn't treat the natives with any proper respect. And it was always racist, and there was always an air of superiority and a lack of follow through with promises for treaties. Whereas they really respected this guy, and he respected them. And you have him pointing to a soldier running, towards the cluster in our vision, holding a fleur de lis and declaring victory. I think one of the things that's also important that Benjamin West does here is he juxtaposes the strength of a Mohawk, who were instrumental in this battle, by the way. And they didn't want, the Iroquois and the Mohawks generally want to stay neutral when the British were fighting the French. They had a lot of alliances. The Jesuits had also organized a lot of alliances with the different native bands, and they didn't want to be militarily connected with either group. And if they were going to be connected with somebody, it was going to be the French. But largely, this guy, William Johnson, his work was instrumental in shifting that. And when they chose to fight alongside the British, that really tipped the scales of battle in the British favor. So that was important. The fact that you have this native as well, who's there as a warrior, expressing a certain strength in contrast to the weakness of the British leader, is also, I think, a message that's being conveyed that you wouldn't necessarily see if you were a British aristocrat, because if you're an American or you're a frontiersman or you're a British aristocrat looking at this, you're going to get 2 very different messages. And that was one of the brilliant things of great artists, is you can walk in the realm of ambiguity and communicate 2 different messages to 2 different people who, may not understand what your actual intention is. So this was a historic changing moment. And again, in 1776, it was unclear what the outcome would be. Would Quebec still end up joining or not? That was not clear. The other thing that made this very, very historic that people take for granted today is that in those days, No history painting had ever been done with contemporary costumes. Every time that a history painting was done, it had to involve the costumes of Greco-Romans from 2,000 years earlier. Nobody did this. And it's weird to think about today because now it's so obvious, like people have been doing this for so long. But this was really, he had a lot of fights, and he was even threatened. He was told, you're never going to get a commission again if you do you break from the rules. But he did it. And he wrote to a friend saying that the event intended to be commemorated took place on the 13th of September, 1759, in a region of the world unknown to the Greeks and Romans, and at a period of time when no such nations nor heroes in their costume any longer existed. The subject I have to represent is the conquest of a great province of America by the British troops. It is a topic that history will proudly record, and the same truth that guides the pen of the historian should govern the pencil of the artist. I consider myself as undertaking to tell this great event to the eye of the world. But if instead of the facts of the transaction I represent classical fictions, how shall I be understood by posterity? So that's a very good point, right? Like, you just couldn't wait. Like, ancient Greece didn't exist, so he won them over. He won over his audience, and when George III saw it, he was very impressed, and actually purchased the painting. The theme, again, the importance of resolving the discontinuities in America between the general welfare and the sacredness of individual freedom. This is so big. And part of the understanding has always been that it will only be when American culture can understand and respect the native cultures, that instead of just treating the natives like they're subhuman and clearing the land with them or anything, but really treat them like partners, and sacred partners at that. At only that point will America acquire the real moral fitness to survive, which is why Cooper later on was always writing with this very dignified view of the native culture and people in his stories. Another painting by Benjamin West, this one was done also the same year, 1771, is again very, very indicative of this. Ben West, keep in mind, he was from Pennsylvania, from Swarthmore. His grandfather was the close friend of William Penn. William Penn was one of the key figures of the Jonathan Swift networks in America, who had acquired a certain area of land, and he was committed not to just using it for wealth extraction the way the British Empire had pushed, but rather really developing the land and developing the inhabitants. Graham Lowry goes through a lot of William Penn's work in his How the Nation Was Won. Really interesting figure. This particular portrait, though, was done indicating a very important moment where a treaty was signed between the Delaware natives and the British. Now, Penn didn't have to sign a treaty. He had the sole authority. He was given the charter to set up this area, to set up a colony by the king in 1682. He didn't have to pay them anything. You know, he could have used the might makes right principle. It had been done before. It was done afterwards, but he chose not to do it anyway. And he chose to instead have a really important historic treaty, paying them very much in a variety of ways and ensuring that they had total freedom to use the land as they saw fit, even after the Europeans settled down. So what we have here is a moment where textiles are being offered, gifts are being offered. We have the cedar tree in the background, which is where the actual signing of the treaty was to take place months later. There's a certain shadow also, I think, that's being cast by the clouds in the background, because there's a certain, I mean, we know that not everything went so peachy keen between the Europeans and the natives, but it was renowned as one of the only treaties to have endured and was really honored for many, many decades. Within the treaty itself, I just think it's so remarkable that I selected several articles of the treaty that should be read. The first article is that all of William Penn's people are Christians, and all of the Indians should be brethren, as the children of one father joined together as with one heart, one head, and one body. Second, that all the paths should be open and free to both Christians and Indians. Third, that all doors of the Christians' houses should be open to the Indians, and the houses of the Indians open to the Christians, and that they should make each other welcome as their friends. Fourth, that the Christians should not believe any false rumors or reports of the Indians, nor the Indians believe any such rumors or reports of the Christians, but should first come as brethren to inquire of each other, and that both Christians and Indians, when they have any such false reports of their brethren, should bury them as in a bottomless pit. This is also very important because you always had intelligence operations, especially Jesuitical intelligence operations, running operations, both conducting slanders, saying one side did this or the other side to induce and increase hostilities between the white man and the natives, or actually using, in a very racist way, certain native groups and bands from Canada, from Quebec, that they would then deploy and conduct massacres, using very, very high-level sort of MK Ultra brainwashing operations. It was a very nasty operation, and it has been written about over the years how these things were done. Frederick Schiller also writes about this in the Jesuit Government in Paraguay Universal History lecture. So this is something that was widespread, and the fact that this was embedded in William Penn's treaty to say that, okay, before we react emotionally, which gets us into trouble by unjustly seeking revenge, let's talk with each other and see if a certain slander or whatever is true first before acting. And that makes all the difference. Number 5, that if the Christians heard any ill news that may be to hurt of the Indians, or the Indians any such ill news that may be to injury of the Christians, they should acquaint each other with it speedily as true friends and brethren. Number 6, that the Indians should do no manner of harm to the Christians, nor to their creatures, nor the Christians any harm to the Indians, but each treat the other as brethren first. But as there are wicked people in all nations, if either Indians or Christians should do any harm to each other, complaint should be made of it by the person suffering, and the right might be done. And when satisfaction is made, the injury or wrong should be forgot and buried as in a bottomless pit. That the Indians should in all things assist the Christians, and the Christians assist the Indians against all wicked people that would disturb them. And lastly, that both Christians and Indians should acquaint their children with this league and firm chain of friendship made between them, and that it should always be made stronger and stronger, and be kept bright and clean without rust or spot between our children and children's children, while the creeks and rivers run, and while the sun and moon and stars endure. Again, very, very important way of thinking that's very emblematic of the Peace of Westphalia, of the benefit of the other, that had just been recently created in 1648, just 40 years before this, as the basis of international relations and the respect of not only your neighbor, but the benefit that all of your actions will be based upon the benefit of your neighbor's welfare, and the forgiveness of past transgressions that Cardinal Mazarin and Colbert innovated. Okay, going back another little bit, the question was always, how do you convey virtue in a painting, right? That's not so easy. You can convey things in a painting, you can convey emotions, but how do you convey the type of universal sentiments and universal characteristics that we really should cherish and value in a real democracy? So to get at this, what we have is, okay. In 1769, this is a painting that Benjamin West did, which again was it really stirred up all of the European nobility. It was purchased for £1,000 by King George III, who really admired it. It was the departure of Regulus for Carthage. As the story goes, Benjamin West selected this moment, embodying really a sublime quality of honor and virtue, where Regulus, who's a Roman leader, he was a former consul of Rome, he's captured in Carthage during the wars, and they basically arrange a deal where he goes back to Rome to the safety of his family and everything, on the condition that he just argues for Rome's surrender. However, by the time he arrives at Rome, he has a change of heart, and he realizes he can't honorably go through this type of argument, and instead encourages the Senate, encourages the people to stand up to Carthage and to fight. Now, he could choose to stay there, right? He doesn't have to go back to Carthage, but he does. He says, well, I disobeyed my word. I will go back and accept whatever repercussions befall me. And on the right side, you have the 3 Carthaginian ambassadors walking out of this area. You have people begging him to stay, right? He's a very loved military hero. They're begging him to stay back. That's him right there in the middle. And he's obviously turning them down. We have here a woman who's very, very pensive. I think this sort of embodies what we should be feeling going through this. Is this the right thing to do, right? So there's a sort of cathartic, I think, experience that we're supposed to have with this particular character who definitely stands out, contemplating the paradoxical nature of this whole scenario. Obviously, these people, this woman just fainted in shock and horror. That might be his wife, I'm not sure. Everybody else is really downtrodden here. So again, it definitely embodied the type of Roman stoic Republican virtue, not Republican, but real virtues, that has a lot of honor. That is admirable, that level of courage to go through with such things, because he was tortured and died, right? Like when he went back to Carthage, he faced torture and he died there. But that was a happier decision for the health of his soul than going through a dishonorable life. So this is something which still resonated with the king. This is 1769. Benjamin West began to spend evenings with the king. He was held back for hours into the evening at Buckingham Palace, discussing philosophy, discussing the nature of government. And he made his views, his pro-Republican views, very well known to the king. But the king, and it shows you there's something about King George III that is not so one-dimensional. It's not so clear-cut to have like this simplistic, the king was evil view of things. And the king recognized that there was something definitely strong and admirable in Benjamin West. And Benjamin West saw there's something definitely noble in the king and in certain members of the British aristocracy. What we have here is another painting that was done later on Cicero discovering the tomb of Archimedes by Benjamin West. I think this is a particularly beautiful story. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but the thing with these historical paintings is it forces you, if you really want to talk about it or think about it, you have to go back and study what the artist was studying when he was inspired to select this moment when these workers are clearing out the weeded over roots and foliage covering up the lost tomb of Archimedes. Who had died at the hands of Roman generals. He was assassinated about 200 years before this event takes place. And you have people obviously in awe, shocked that here Cicero actually found it. Now, this is a story that takes place in a dialogue called the Tuscolan Disputations. And I had a chance to read some of this. I didn't finish it yet. But Cicero's writings are, I mean, it's like Plato. It's like reading his dialogues. It's glorious. And in the Tuscolan dialogues, keep in mind, Benjamin West, he already painted the last days of Socrates, where the discussion of the immortality of the soul exists. Is there a soul? How do we know? What evidence can our reason find that such a thing even exists? Because Socrates is not afraid to die. But all of his followers are very depressed and sad and scared. Why is he not afraid? And so this entire dialogue is set up to investigate how does the mind come to understand whether one should be happy or afraid of death? Is death truly the liberation of the soul? How do we know if the soul doesn't also perish with the body? If it does exist, maybe it still lives just as long as the body, or maybe it just lives for several bodies and transmigrates, but then also like perishes like an old coat after being worn by several owners, right? And the coat wears away. Maybe that happens. How do you know that the soul is as immortal as ideas of justice or ideas of like the square, right? You can't imagine a moment before which there was no square, right? And then all of a sudden square came into being. It's like, no, square has the concept of square, even though you know every drawing of square is imperfect and is ephemeral and temporal and bounded in space and time. The idea of square, it doesn't have any of those boundary conditions of time or in space, right? Is the soul like that? Does the soul have that quality to it? And so that whole dialogue, it's a beautiful dialogue, and that was his first painting. This, the Tuscolan Disputations, you can Google it and read it online. Everything I've read so far, it basically takes and pursues that discourse on the immortality of the soul. And he also incorporates some of the Gorgias dialogue of how do you live a good life? What is a good life? Is it a life of power and the pursuit of pleasure, where you actually have the power to satisfy your pleasures and get rid of your pains? That's what some tyrants would say is a good life. So in the Disputations is where he describes his discovery of Archimedes' tomb. And in it, he says, I will present you with a humble and obscure mathematician of the same city called Archimedes, who lived for many years after, whose tomb, overgrown with shrubs and briars in my quaestorship, discovered when the Syracusans knew nothing of it, and even denied that there was any such thing. For, I'm sorry, my camera's all messed up. For I remembered some verses which I had been informed were engraved on this monument, and these set forth that on the top of the tomb there were placed a sphere with a cylinder. When I had carefully examined all the monuments, I observed a small column standing out a little above the briars, with the figure of a sphere and a cylinder upon it, whereupon I immediately said to the Syracusans, for there were some of their principal men with me there, that I imagined that was what I was inquiring for. Several men, being sent in with the scythes, cleared the way and made an opening for us. When we could get at it and were come near to the front of the pedestal, I found the inscription through the latter parts of the verses, parts of all the verses were effaced almost halfway. Thus, one of the noblest cities of Greece, and one which at one time likewise had been very celebrated for learning, had known nothing of the monument of its greatest genius, if it had not been discovered to them by a native of Arpinium. But to request to the subject from which I have been digressing, but to return to the subject from which I had been digressing, who is there in the least degree acquainted with the Muses, that is, with liberal knowledge, or that deals at all in learning, who would not choose to be this mathematician rather than this tyrant? If we look into their methods of living and their employments, we shall find the mind of the one strengthened and improved with tracing the deductions of reason, amused with his own ingenuity, which is the one most delicious food of the mind. The thoughts of the other engaged in continual murders and injuries, in constant fears by night and day. Okay. So that's just a little segment where he's getting across, right, that the life of a philosopher and a scientist is better lived and more valuable than the life of a tyrant. He's also making the point, I think, as a foreigner to Britain, getting across that just like as Cicero was a foreigner to Syracuse, it took a foreigner to go in and actually discover what made this civilization great. They themselves had forgotten their own true heritage. So I think that's another layer to this thing, why he was attracted to this particular story. So we have here, through Regulus, through William Penn, we have through the story of Cicero and Archimedes, a certain honor, a certain view of sovereignty of the individual, right? Because you can only be a true sovereign person if you don't have a fear of losing your sensual gratification, right? The part of your identity associated with the pursuit of pleasure. So most people who are just petrified of death are never going to be meritorious of the types of liberties that are enunciated in the Declaration of Independence or Constitution. People had to risk losing their lives to fight for those liberties, right? So that's a society of subjects that's afraid of death that way. And Benjamin West understands how this is the source of a lot of our corruption. A lot of people do corrupt things because they're afraid of death, or they fall for mystical beliefs because they're afraid of their own immortality. They're afraid of the implications of, if their soul is immortal, they should be living their lives in a very different way. So let's contrapose that now to the message he's delivering now in three paintings I've selected. Number one is 1777, during the American Revolution. This is a definite message to King George III. George III is known as the Mad King. He's the king who went insane and was ultimately taken out of office in 1810 because they realized he lost his marbles too much. But he had several bouts with insanity starting in the 1780s even, and there were signs of it before that. Might be because he like Marquis de Lafayette, had two separate sort of impulses within him. He admired things in the human genius. He admired virtues that were antagonistic to the British organizing principles of society, the British Empire organizing principles. This is a story that Benjamin West painted of Saul and the Witch of Endor. Do people know the story from the Bible, from the Old Testament, of Saul and the Witch of Endor? Anyone? Anybody paid attention in their Bible studies classes in school?
Is it about King Saul?
Yeah, King Saul.
Yeah. Well, I read about King Saul, but not this particular thing. I don't know about it.
Okay. Well, King Saul was about to go to war with the Philistines, and he was very afraid, and he couldn't figure out what do I do? What type of battle plan do I use? Do I go to war even? Maybe I shouldn't. And he was trying to get advice from Samuel, a prophet who had died, but he'd already expelled all of the seers and witches and what have you. So he's like, ah, damn! I expelled all of the people who could help me out. So he went undercover and went into an area of Endor and found a witch who was able to help him for money. And she invoked, all of a sudden, the words of Samuel came ringing from whatever, behind a tree or something. And there was smoke and a lot of sort of mystical lights. And basically the forecast was given to him with somebody speaking with Samuel's voice that, yeah, you're going to go to battle tomorrow and you're not only going to be defeated, but you're going to die. And he was broken. He was just like, no. And he was emotionally wrecked. He fell down begging for some different outcome. She's like, I'm sorry. And the next day, indeed, that's exactly what happened. He ended up getting injured badly and actually committed suicide. So if it wasn't going to happen, he made it happen. The forecast had that much power, kind of like the character of Hamlet, right? In the story by Shakespeare. Whether or not the forecast by the ghost, or even, you could say even Macbeth, right? Actually, that's probably even a better one, where the witches of Macbeth are more like the witch of Endor, where the three witches give them this whole forecast and they plant these seeds so that you end up actually acting out what might not have otherwise happened if your mind hadn't become obsessed with this idea, this naive idea of an oracle telling you how the future is going to unfold, to the point that you just acted stupidly. So that's one aspect. That's one story. Another story that he paints, also, obviously, you could see why he would be making a lot of enemies at this point with the intelligentsia of the evil aspect of the Hellfire Club Britain. This is a scene from King Lear. He did several paintings depicting different scenes from Shakespeare's King Lear. This is from the famous, Act 3, Scene 4 and 5, where King Lear is in a storm, and I mean, it's just such a situation. He stumbles on somebody who he did a lot of wrong to, who's now just in faking insanity, named Tom Bedlam, who's living in like a cave and has been living there for several years, and the storm is raging outside of him. King Lear has been betrayed by his daughters. He's just a foolish king. His whole life has been folly, and now he's paying the consequences, and he's been totally, he's wandering around with a fool, a jester. It's a really insightful play. And at this moment, he has the opportunity to go inside and get out of the rain of the storm. And he's like, no, the rain in the storm in my head is worse than the rain outside of me. And this is, I don't mind. And he has this moment of cogency where he actually says, this is my suffering for the wrongs that I did to my people by not taking care of the poor in my kingdom, who these poor have to suffer in these sorts of physical ways. And now I'm suffering too. This is justice befalling me. And he has this like moment of sanity. And what we see in front of us is the moment where he's talking to this other guy who's been totally wronged. And he was originally a courtier, and now he's like running around naked, and he starts getting, basically he hears this guy's terrible story and starts getting naked himself in sympathy with this other guy. Anyway, it's a really tragic tale. But again, definite message to anybody who's a king at that time, especially a king struggling with insanity, which is not just a neurological. I mean, there's obviously a war with which the king's soul is having with himself that's inducing him into losing his grounding. And that's more insightful than the type of sort of modern Freudian psychoanalysis that tries to diagnose insanity without understanding, taking into consideration the nature of the soul, of a healthy soul and a sick soul, and the lies we tell ourselves. It's so much more insightful psychologically to read Shakespeare or to look at a Benjamin West painting. The last painting, the third in the series that I've selected here, is from a large mural. These are huge paintings. On Pharaoh and his host chasing the Jews that have just declared their freedom and have won their freedom and have now crossed the Red Sea, and the sea now collapses in on the Pharaoh's host and the Pharaoh. So killing them. That's again, definitely there was a lot of denial that, the British aristocracy had believed that they had done everything that they could do to treat their colonists well. Ben Franklin and Ben West and others knew otherwise. And in fact, there were top-down policies imposed by the British Empire to ensure that that the colonists would not be allowed to have access to manufacturing. They would be kept impoverished. They would not be allowed to go west beyond the Allegheny Mountains and just be kept sort of shackled in a little sliver by the Atlantic Ocean. And that was always done to crush the potential Promethean spirit in the colonists. So again, the fact that the president, at this point, this is the same year that Benjamin West becomes the president of the Royal Society. Before that, it was Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was a decent painter, but nowhere near the level of moral philosophy as Benjamin West. And Benjamin West remains the president until his death in 1820. At this time, Benjamin West is also, like I said, any young talent from America who becomes a painter, they're all studying under Benjamin West. He creates a very specific atmosphere, a protective atmosphere for students to learn the greatest techniques and also the mode of communicating ideas. In 1778, Lord Chatham, who's also William Pitt the Elder, dies in Parliament. Actually, not really. The story goes he dies in Parliament. In reality, he died 34 days later, but they created a bit of an apocryphal story. But Benjamin West immortalizes this moment. I think that just as another statement of his Republican principles. The British, again, they like it. They think he's doing honor to William Pitt. But if you actually look at what William Pitt was doing when he died, he came out to try to fight a bill that was being pushed through by the Duke of Richmond, who on March 23rd called for withdrawal of all British troops from the United States, right after getting word that the French were going to come in assisting the American cause. And the bill was defeated 56 votes in the House of Lords to 28. But Chatham on April 5th came out to fight this bill and to fight these soft lords who wanted to let the Americans go free and declare their independence. And he said, "My lords, I rejoice that the grave has not closed upon me, and that I am still alive to lift up my voice against the dismemberment of this ancient and most noble monarchy. Pressed down as I am by the hand of infirmity, I am little able to assist my country in this most perilous conjuncture. But my lords, while I have sense and memory, I will never consent to deprive the royal offspring of the House of Brunswick, the heirs of the Princess Sophia, of their fairest inheritance. Where is the man that will dare to advise such a measure? My lords, his majesty succeeded to an empire as great in extent as its reputation was unsullied. Shall we tarnish the luster of this nation by an ignominious surrender of its rights and fairest possessions? Surely, my lords, this nation is no longer what it was. Shall a people that 17 years ago was the terror of the world now stoop so low as to tell its ancient inveterate enemy, take all we have, only give us peace? It is impossible. My lords, any state is better than despair. Let us at least make one effort, and if we must fail, let us fail like men." And then he collapses in a seizure and dies soon thereafter, which you could say is the death of the man, but is it also not potentially expressive of the death of the idea that he lived for, right? As he died, so did his cause die. And Copley, another American born the same year as Benjamin West, who also studied with West at the Royal Academy, who was in that first painting, did another rendition in 1781 of the same moment, this time juxtaposing it with the defeat of the Spanish Armada on the wall by the British 200 years earlier, which is, I think, again, expressive of the past grandeur of the British Empire's memories dying with this man in this moment of historical change, that the maritime empire of the world that became the empire when it defeated the Spanish Armada was no longer the case. I think it's just a beautiful painting. And finally, not finally, but almost finally, Ben Franklin. So Ben Franklin, we're told today that there aren't that many points of connection of Benjamin West and Benjamin Franklin beyond what I said. No, this is 1783, the Peace of Paris. This painting was done by Benjamin West. Benjamin Franklin was the godfather of Benjamin West's son, Benjamin. Now, so keep in mind, his father was a friend of Benjamin Franklin's directly, and put the first lightning rod in the house. That Ben Franklin was the Prometheus of America. That's what he was called by leading European scientists and statesmen. The whole cause of the fight for natural law on the moral level politically with the Declaration was tied always inextricably with the discovery of electricity and the transmission of that to everybody to benefit all alike, and the application of electricity in the form of inventions, which Ben Franklin innovated and communicated through poetry, through his Poor Richard's Almanac and other writings, were all tied. Politics, economics, science, the arts, it was all intersected. So when the British finally were to sign the peace treaty ending officially the American Revolutionary War in 1783, you have there several people. You have John Jay, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Henry Lorenz, and the young man is William Temple Franklin, Ben Franklin's grandson, whose father was the British Anglophile governor of New Jersey, who was really, I mean, they didn't get along well, obviously, but his grandson was a little bit smarter and was part of the delegation. Now, the reason why it's not finished is that the British never really ultimately accepted in their hearts that they lost the war. The British delegation never showed up for the portrait sitting. So it's a half-done portrait, which I think is perfect because it was never a completed revolution, as we've come to discover, 250 years later. The revolution still goes on. The British never were extracted from the United States. So by 1815, this is a portrait. I think it's the most Prometheus. It's not a very subtle portrait, but this is a Benjamin West portrait of Ben Franklin, where he's really embodying the Promethean principle, right? 1815, the King, George III, at this point had gone completely insane, was taken out of power. Ben West wasn't receiving any royal sponsorship or patronage at this point. And he sort of like shows, I think, more literally his cards in his heart more openly by portraying Ben Franklin, who had discovered electricity the way he did and made his proof of principle experiment with the key that was able to capture a charge from a thunderbolt in the sky that was then, shown to be controllable. Which Samuel Morse later on was able to then transmit information with in the form of communication with the Morse code. Again, this was done with the help of a variety of scientists around the Humboldts, including Gauss, Weber, and Ampere, who had already made smaller versions of what Samuel B Morse had extended miles long. They had already done little telegraphs. And in the background, you have little metaphors of little child with a native, there's a certain Native American motif on one of the angel children in the background, which is, I think, interesting. I don't fully know what it means, but I think it's interesting. And you have I think the fact that you have a certain older man quality for this cherub in the background playing with this electrical experiment. So you have both this baby-like, childlike, innocent quality, but you also have this more adult imagery infused in one persona. It sort of does a little bit what I think the Marquis de Lafayette painting does a little bit later, showcasing that if you're going to be a real scientist, you can't let go of your inner child, right? If you want to be creative, you have to hold on to that childlike awe of nature and lack of arrogance that a child has to be playful. Otherwise, creativity doesn't really flourish, doesn't exist.
Matt, a quick one on that last painting. If you look back to the experiment in the background, kind of left back, that frame, either semicircular or circular, is kind of interesting. It almost gets me to what you were thinking about the electric universe type of view or orbital mechanics. I mean, I noted that and I thought it kind of odd.
Well, definitely Benjamin Franklin was not a Newtonian. And if he were alive today, I think he would be very, very responsive to the electric universe model of how, you know, the cosmos are organized, not through Newtonian forces of esoteric gravitation or something, or action at a distance, but rather that there's this integrated electrical system, electromagnetic system, around which planets move, around which life is organized to evolve in a certain direction with certain attributes. Yeah, I think that that's fair. John, I'm not sure, do you recognize what that experiment is with the electric orb in the background?
No, I'd have to check it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that might have been played with by Ampere and stuff, but I'm not sure. With your comment about action at a distance, Weber's equations all assume action at a distance between charged particles. So the questioning of action at a distance is to introduce the field theory of James Clerk Maxwell, who rubbishes Weber's work. So I think we have to be careful on these words. I'm not saying I have any answers, but I think we have to be very careful with these words.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Because action at a distance may simply be that there's something being transmitted, but at such an astonishing speed that we have no way of measuring it.
That's true. That's a very good point. And no, I think increasingly we've seen evidence increasingly that,
I mean, when I'm saying orders,
on other sides of a galaxy separated by, you know, hundreds or thousands of light years that are happening almost simultaneously, indicating that there's other dynamics in operation that are beyond the ones we know about.
So what we call the speed of light is if we make a dynamic with transmission through other media that we better understand, such as air and water, we have what are called transverse waves and direct waves. And it's the transverse waves that are moving at the so-called speed of light, but the direct waves go much faster than transverse waves in both air and water.
Right.
So I'm just saying we had to be very careful with these words.
Yeah.
So
I think overall,
the final story is not written.
No, absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and just like the school of thought of Ben Franklin, of Ampere, of Weber, that entire way of thinking in the sciences that also was advanced by Samuel Morse and Joseph Henry, just like that needs to be revived in our current age to overcome a lot of these absurd paradoxes that are really holding back science. Like black holes, you know, standard model cosmology, standard model microphysics from the Copenhagen school, all this stuff. We need to go to something that's more coherent, more natural, more in alignment with how these discoveries were actually made. Same thing for the arts, right? That these great artists were using a mode of thinking, a paradigm that was not just ivory tower, but that they applied to get certain effects that both awoke discoveries in the sciences, but also it awoke political emancipation movements towards the political liberation of society from empire, and that were inextricably connected to economics, right? So this is something which was artificially cut off and derailed after the Civil War, in the arts at least. You had it also derail in the 20th century in the sciences. And if we're going to get a new paradigm politically, economically, that's befitting of human civilization, where we can get out of this whole unipolar empire agenda, which is really self-destructive. There's no future built into that system. It's maybe, if you're lucky, maybe dark age and civilizational collapse into a few 100 million people, if you can avoid a nuclear war. But there's no future in that paradigm. So if we're going to get out of that, certain other more natural modes have to be recovered in the form of a real new renaissance, just like what happened after the Dark Ages in the 15th century. And this is what these guys were doing in America and in Britain and beyond. So yeah, I would just say that that's the purpose of my class, is really to think about the future more than to look at the past, but to think, okay, let's learn from the experience of how do you create institutions that transcend lifetimes, but that are in alignment with natural law, because we're going to have to do it again. We're going to need great poets. We're going to need great musicians, great literature, and great painters and great scientists that really do what is not being done right now. Yeah, if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free.
I have a lot of thoughts.
Okay, go for it, Dave.
Well, among the first thing is, since we're still on the painting question, you mentioned at a certain point this idea of realism, and like what is it that is the great artist is trying to capture in painting. And I had been recently thinking about this whole idea of the way a lot of modern abstract art narratives are framed. It's like before there used to be this tradition of realism where we just paint things as they appear. We just describe the world as it looks like and sort of within the confines of how things actually look like to our senses. But that's a total sort of misrepresentation and fallacy about what classical painting is really portraying, because it's really portraying ideas which are immaterial, and the seen is only one instance of the unseen, and we're being presented with certain images which we have to sort of resolve into a whole, which is which underlies the idea. And so that discussion of realism is totally misleading. If you see the way people talk about art today, right, there's no sense of exactly what you said of irony, that Benjamin West was really looking to implant, ironies, things that would, nice cat, sort of provoke people. And that's what's missing today, right? People have this really descriptive way of thinking, and they're not really understanding what great art is really trying to do.
Yeah.
So it's really a disservice, and that's why we really do need painting that, there's no such thing as realism. The ideas are we capturing higher transcendent truths as we treat the sense perceptual world, or are we just treating that as a thing in of itself, which doesn't really, if that's all we're doing, then it doesn't really tell you anything. It doesn't really have any meaning. All it is perceptions and feelings. Mm-hmm. But there's no sense of an idea. And so they just sort of reduce images to feelings, and here's this story even, or that story. But the question is, the story is just a shadow, right? It's just it's a metaphor itself. Even when you're painting a story, it's not really the story that's the subject, but it's what is it that this story is trying, what higher truth is this story actually conveying?
Right.
So yeah, people really have lost the ability to think in terms of ideas.
Well, there's definitely a dichotomy that's been created artificially between realism and emotion. Like logic and emotion are separated into two separate universes. Where we're told either, if you want, like there's some interesting organizations out there currently to try to revive classical painting. One of them is called the Art Renewal Center. But the problem is when you look through the stuff, the material, there's a beautiful technique and it's a noble effort, but a lot of the pieces, the majority I would say, are photorealism. So they're basically just trying to do what a camera can do. And maybe like adding a little touch, a little color of their emotion, but just a little bit. There's no idea, there's no irony being set up, no contrast to induce the mind to like go, what's that all about? And think about it. There's not a lot of that's happening. So that creates this artificial counter response where then people say, no, I want to feel my emotions. I want to express my emotions. I don't want to be stifled by my sensual reality. So then then they fall into the reactionary schools, on the other side of the fence, which totally disband reality, and it's all just how you feel. But again, there's no ideas. There's no higher ideas in that. It's really just different touches and flavors and tones of emotion. And some emotions are not terrible, like they're not all going to make you a worse person, but they definitely don't take you to that higher transcendental level. And it's just like the realistic paintings. You can't say that they're making you a worse person. They're not. In some cases, it's admirable what these photorealistic painters can do, but it's not transforming anything. You're still going to be the same person at the end of the day. But that's why I think I'd like to do down, sooner than later is to really deliver an introduction to the Hudson River School painting, and also maybe some of the work by Eakins, who Jerry introduced me to, and is just a really wonderful painter. So you have these different American school traditions that endured into the 1900s, even early 1900s. Afterwards, I mean, the only representative of this way of thinking and expressing oneself in the arts was primarily Norman Rockwell, who died in the 70s. But by then, the world had been really increasingly commercialized. So a lot of the great artists became absorbed into commercial arts and were no longer respected as being fine artists anymore. So you were told, if you wanted to be a real artist, a real high artist, you had to deconstruct yourself and just paint things that people wouldn't really want to pay money to look at in contemporary arts or modern arts museums. And that way, you'll have your elite patronage. You'll get a grant from the National Council in Canada or whatever, sponsors that you're going to get. You'll get money. But if you want to paint things that actually look good, then you have to go into commercial arts. Do graphic novels.
Or you can just put an empty easel up and say that's art. That's art.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, just get paid for doing nothing.
Or just throw paint at the wall. Oh, sorry, that's Jackson Pollock.
Or strap a banana on the easel and just say that's art. And you get you get millions of dollars for doing that.
Oh,
doing what a 2-year-old child can do.
Yeah. Matt?
Yeah.
It's very similar to what's happened with music. If you listen to the local classical station here in Toronto, the whole thing has evolved into accepting composers who write background music for the movies. That's considered the modern expression of classical music. That if you go to university, study music, and you want to be anybody, you're not going to get a job making music. You get a job writing music for movies or for TVs. It's theme music.
It's ironic because they're a lot of the movies in Hollywood were influenced by people like Dvorak, the student of Brahms. And if you listen to the New World Symphony and a lot of his stuff that he was trying to do with certain Native American motifs, there's something you can recognize from Hollywood epics, but they took out all of the development and they just used some of the emotional effects and just made it. That's what it is. That's all it is. When you listen to a Star Wars scene, soundtrack or something. So you have elements of it, but that's all it is. It's just the elements. It's not the actual. It's not for any developmental purpose of the mind.
And didn't Shostakovich and Prokofiev also write movie music?
I don't know. Is that true?
They did. Battleship Potemkin and Ivan Nevsky. They were serious composers who wrote the music.
I don't really know them. Are they good?
Yeah. I mean, it's not the Leningrad Symphony, but it's.
Okay. Well, I know that the same thing happened. If I do give this class on the Hudson River School and how it was derailed, it was derailed through a similar technique, where you saw some of these beautiful grandeur images of landscapes, right? That are just so. It's almost like there's a divine quality in the landscape, and how it's very unique how they do that. And they're innovating ways of expressing light and darkness in very new ways that had never been done before. But then by the 1890s, money is just being poured into trying to only use their work on light to get like the French luminescent movement in America. And all of these artists increasingly started accommodating their technique to the markets, because they couldn't sell their frames. They couldn't be put in galleries using their old techniques. And so increasingly it just became the use of light to get like dreamlike imagery, to get people into a feeling state. and there was no longer anything higher being developed in the paintings. And you can just see it. That's where the money went in the 1880s, 90s, and a lot of these great painters, including the Canadian painters. There was a Canadian Hudson River School of Painting in the 1760s, 1860s, 70s, 80s, and these, you could just watch in time how these great painters are doing incredible things in the 1860s and 70s, and then by the 1880s and 90s, these same people have just totally deconstructed, and they're just doing like little. It's just weird. It's like you're in a dream. Oh wait, Lazarus, you're on mute.
I was gonna say they sold out by being deconstructed. They then sold out.
Yeah, it's kind of a dynamic process, right? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Like you commercialize something, and then you, in a way, when you commercialize and pour a lot of money into something, you destroy the soul of it, and it just becomes another commercial enterprise where you just make money and there's no higher thought put into it.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, you want, because yeah, the irony is you want your artists to be remunerated, right? Like, and you want patronage to go to arts and to free people up so that they can express themselves in a healthy society. Yeah. So you want it to be lucrative, but that's where the culture needs to come in, because you can't have people who live for money or live for material pleasure. You have to have souls who are a bit more refined to want and desire the higher enjoyments, which only a soul can enjoy, and not, anything below the belt.
At the same time, you don't want starving artists the same as well.
No, you don't.
The thing is that the quality of the art can only be as good as the quality of the audience.
Yes, no.
Yes.
No,
exactly.
perhaps I'm pushing it there, but the idea is, of course, the art can be contributing to raising the culture of the audience. But what I'm saying is that if the audience is expecting mediocrity, it's very difficult and is pleased with mediocrity. It is very difficult to do anything more.
I think that's where you have a chance to do something different, because you, as an artist, have the liberty, you have the freedom to do something, to create something.
Yeah, an example recently in Montreal was a famous Hungarian pianist came to conduct Bartók's. I forget the piece.
Oh yeah, Andrus.
And he ended up in a fight with the orchestra because he expected them to actually have practiced before they met him.
Yeah, and the orchestra didn't want to. The members of the orchestra didn't actually want to follow his own guidance, and they were stubborn. They're like, "No, I'm doing it my way. My conductor says I can do it this way," and he's like, "I can't work with you people. You're like, yeah."
So, cheers.
Ciao. I had one more idea that you had brought up with the whole Marquis of Lafayette, and first general thought that a lot of these artists, I mean, you have to be a conscious historical citizen in some degree if you're to capture, the drama of your own age, and that's sort of an impetus of trying to capture that in art, right? Like all these American painters, it's not. Yeah, there's the American Revolution. That's one of the driving. I mean, they're conscious of that. Like they're thinking about what's happening in the real world, and they're using that to inspire their imaginations. Wrestling with greater paradoxes. But it was interesting the whole Lafayette thing, because he sort of went for the monarchy constitutional organization instead, right, and sort of fell for that trap. But I was reading something that really made me think. This idea of freedom, like you have a phenomena today. I was reading Huxley, and he talks about it, and he might mean many different things. But the idea that human beings don't. There's this idea of freedom which is being fought for, but often when people have freedom, he was remarking how the startling fact that people actually can be. Once they have freedom, it's actually surprising the degree to which people are actually want to relinquish their freedom, and that they don't want to be free. and you have these superstructures that are able to sort of take over. And I was thinking about it, because people need to know things, right? The whole idea of a republic is people have to be able to have a dialogue and discuss ideas, right? Ideas that actually shape the world around them. But today you have this phenomena where, yeah, people, in a sense, the idea of freedom is very, it can be seen as, or like dangerous, in the sense that, oh, well, you know, the world's overpopulated, we're over consuming, and you do need laws to sort of be brought in to sort of control people's behavior, that they shouldn't really be free to make their own choices because they can't. And so there's this sort of push where, I mean, whether it's about vaccines today, should they be mandated or not, or, you know, should there be, you know, supranational systems controlling finance, controlling all these things because nations aren't able to do it. I mean, it's just this idea of the monarchy, all that to say that, you know, there's this today, there's a tendency towards globalism and all these things, and people are sort of freely giving away their rights, almost with the sense that like freedom is a bad thing and we need these sort of controls. And I guess, you know, I just thought it was interesting that Lafayette, he sort of, you know, he went for the whole monarchy thing, in that, you know, no, we can't just have people directly represented and choosing their leaders. You need this structure in which this is to happen. So it's this paradox that really people have to be able to discuss ideas at a very high level if they are to be free, if they are to actually be governed freely and to govern themselves. And so this argument of sort of taking away people's freedoms is actually pretty provocative, but it's largely in part because people have lost an ability to think in terms of higher ideas, the kind of ideas and ironies that we, you know, have to deal with in great art.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, guys, I think we had a really productive little 2.5 hour spurt here. I'm really glad that you guys, you know, hung on for the whole thing. That was great. And
I'll try to.
Next week we'll have Anton Chaikin, who's gonna bestow some wisdom upon us and take us through some of Benjamin Franklin's Lunar Society and other things.
Mhm.
After that, we might have something by Martin Seif. I'm not sure. The holidays are a little bit in flux. It's hard to plan out. No matter what happens, barring something really terrible, I guess. But according to current plans, we're planning on doing a science program of about 7 or 8 classes on as above, so as below, starting in January, where we're going to then go into different presentations tackling the electric universe, Leibniz versus Newton, different ways that we can break this wall separating the laws of the astrophysics with the laws of the microphysics, or the laws of our internal universe as human beings subjectively with the external objective laws of the macrocosm that we live in. All of these barriers are just artificially put up as walls that really prevent people from developing and integrating their potential. So we're going to just explore that, and maybe we'll have some homework as well. I'm hoping that we can get some homework too.
Well, thanks for the class, Matt.
Yeah, Matt, thanks a lot. It was a great class.
My pleasure, guys. There'll be more.
See you next week.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.